I'm sure most of us here in the room would agree that decarbonization is largely now on government's agenda as compared to maybe 3 to 4 years ago. And that has really led the momentum for renewables in the region to really speed up. So Frank, Sunseap's one of the first mover in the industry here in Singapore and in the wider region. You're definitely a veteran in the industry. Could you share some clean tech trends with us? And what are the things that we should be watching out for?
So firstly, good morning, everyone. And I see a lot of familiar faces from Bangkok Bank. And Bangkok Bank used to, for those who don't know, Bangkok Bank used to be our shareholder in Sunseap. I think made some money, I hope. So I think on trends, there are many, right? So to name a few, I think you're right to say that every country in this region has almost set a target for net zero. Some is 2050, some 2060 net zero, but I think we are all going in the direction of decarbonization. So with that, I always believe that if you know COVID is coming, what will you prepare yourself for? If you know climate change is coming, net zero is coming, what will you prepare yourself for as well, right? So green jobs will be on the rise. There is a program here in Singapore that we started, we call it Solar Technologies. Right, so we train anyone who is inexperienced into someone who can install and eventually become someone who can design and even commission the system. Right, so we have a project that is ongoing in Indonesia to Singapore. Is a part of the cross-border projects as well. So this project alone, we are expecting to hire 20,000 people just to install this one project. It's a massive project, right? So there will be many green jobs requirement. There will also, I mentioned cross-border, so the ASEAN green grid, right? The grid that we have been talking about for the last 30 years. I believe this is the correct time, all right, with the demand of clean energy from Singapore. Singapore has announced we are going to import 4 gigawatt. This is 4 gigawatt of firm power, right? If you translate that into solar on the ground, usually the easy math I will do is multiply that by 7, and that's 28, right? Or even more, right? Solar in the ground, right? So that means it's a big, massive demand that Singapore will have, and I think many countries like Malaysia, Thailand have also looked into cross-border projects as well. So that is another trend. Yeah.
Thanks, and I think that's definitely something. Even Vietnam now in their PDP8 is targeting power for exports out of the country. So that's definitely a big one to watch. And I think nowadays when we talk about renewables, one thing that we can't get away from is the discussion around supply chain. China holds, a key share in global manufacturing, especially, for the solar panel industry. And there are now talks about whether that should be decentralized, whether, countries should look into localization of supply chain. In your opinion, are there any strategic changes that's needed to shift this reliance?
I think with the trade war happening between US and China and Europe, in particular about solar panel and the origin of the raw materials, now because of this specific issue from Xinjiang, right? I think US have blocked all panels with raw materials that's based out from Xinjiang. I think our organization EDPR in the US last year alone, we have several hundred megawatts stuck at the port of the US that was not able to go into the port because of this single issue. So this issue is very real, right? So, but because of this, US is short of a few hundred megawatts from our company alone. So there are many gigawatts that are uninstalled last year. There is definitely a lot of alternatives, China alternative that the region is sorting out to be. So for example, I think there are already manufacturing plants in Vietnam, in Malaysia, Cambodia. Recently, I mentioned about that Indonesia project that we are working on, right? So a cross-border project is also like a trade between that country, right? So Indonesia is looking forward to bring the ecosystem of China, the supply chain that you talk about, right? And bring it into Indonesia, and maybe Riau Islands near to Singapore can be a China alternative. So all this set up, there are a lot of talks between the US government and the Indonesian government to allow for the local content that is made in Indonesia panels to go to US eventually. Yeah.
Thanks. And I think if we talk about bottlenecks, I think we have really moved beyond things like policy, having the regulatory framework, technology consents, or having availability of financing. Nowadays we're talking about like land availability, grid bottlenecks. How do we navigate these challenges?
I think that's a very generic point, right? Because we have more than just land and financing challenge. Grid resiliency has always been a topic, right? So take, for example, Singapore. Yesterday, I was part of the EMA forum, and we are thinking about the next 30 years towards 2050, we want to be net zero. How much, there was a question raised, how much energy storage do we need to put in place to allow for the entire grid to go towards renewables, right? Or even alternatives like hydrogen. So I think there's no one silver bullet, right? So there is a combination of various technologies to allow for the net zero to be achieved. So likewise for financing, I think we need to be a little bit more open, all right? So there are many new technologies, like including energy storage technologies like vanadium flow, for example. We are now exploring it. Can we make it bankable eventually? So we start with trials. Eventually, we scale up, right? And of course, get comfort behind the lenders, technical advisors, and the banks as well for all this new stuff. But I think the journey is definitely there. We just got to walk it together. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess as you mentioned at the start, if we know that something's coming, we really need to look at all the options that we have. As you mentioned, there's also no silver bullet, and we really need to harness all that's available to us. Net zero by 2050. Do you think that's possible?
It's a challenge, right? But I think it's definitely possible. And I think we shouldn't look at 2050 and say, it's too far, it's the next generation, right? I think it's important to set intermediary targets. So for example, Singapore has, by 2 years' time, 2025, we have a 1.5 gigawatt target in Singapore alone. If we rewind 10 years, nobody would expect Singapore to have a gigawatt target, right? But here we are, 1.5 gigawatts. 2030, we want to achieve 2, right? And with this first 2, this will set the foundation of our roadmap towards almost 9 gigawatts, 8.6 gigawatts to be exact, when we map up the total area available in Singapore to be installed in the next 30 years or so. So I think this gigawatt targets is just a reflection of how much and how far we have come. There will be new areas that we will utilize, right? Because Singapore is so small without area. We have, I think also, interestingly, if you are moving around Singapore, you just have to look up. We have a lot of HDB flats. Today, we are at phase number 8, Solar Nova 8, we call it. By the time SN8 is over, in terms of the tender is happening now. When it's over, we will have installed 9,500 HDB blocks out of 10,000. That's 95%. So can you imagine 95% of our HDB, which is about 10,000 in total, is covered with solar panels. So you just have to look up and you'll see your solar panels. So once we use up all the horizontal, just think in terms of horizontal and vertical areas, we will then look into vertical areas, right? Solar fencing. So things that are unconventional, we will be starting to look into it, BIPV, all right? But I think a combination of all this is required to hit that 9 gigawatt that we talk about. And for net zero, a lot more, right? Singapore has famously announced our 4 switches as well. So some solar to regional power grids, which is the cross-border projects, to low carbon alternatives like hydrogen, for example, right? I think these are all necessary to piece together towards a solution. We have also rolled out what we call an E50 paper, all right? This Energy 50 2050 paper to illustrate the different scenarios of how we can achieve net zero. So we have a plan, but of course it's up to the execution of this plan in the next 30 years. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And I think you mentioned that it definitely is going to be a challenge. We don't have a lot of runway left if we're looking at net zero by 2050, right? 30 years sounds long, but actually for a net zero target future, that's basically tomorrow. So maybe one last closing question to you. How do you keep optimistic in the midst of all these challenges?
A lot of these projects are, I would say, very long drawn. It can be very tiring because when, like for example, the Indonesia one that we work on it for the last 3 years, right? So maybe I have some Japanese friends who have a lot of patience, will run projects for 10 years and still business developing that project. But I think it's important to look at what we have done so far, right? The road so far. I mentioned, if you look up, just have to look up, 95% of HDB blocks is covered with solar. And very soon we'll look at vertical surfaces. All these various, I would say, little projects that we have developed in Singapore will allow these ideas to be exported into the region. Singapore is government like to use this term called living lab, right? So we are testing, we are also trying to commercialize the solution, and then we'll bring it out of Singapore, right? Not just the rooftop. If you think about our land, for example, solar land, there's a whole idea of mobile solar land. I mean, nowhere on earth you will look at a solar farm that can move, right? But Singapore, because of transient land, transient temporary vacant land, we want to use that land for a couple of years and move it. So there's a whole solar land project, we call it under JTC in Singapore. So with all these ideas, right, then we will export it into the region. So I think the more, there are the ideas like dual usage of area as well. So all these little projects, all right, if you look at it so far in Singapore, it keeps me optimistic, all right, that we have a chance to really deploy towards net zero, and not just for Singapore, but in the region.
Thanks, Frank. And I think that's a great reminder that we all have to remain optimistic and to continuously search for innovative solutions in what is going to be definitely a challenging journey ahead. Thank you again for being here with us.